There was no dramatic breaking point. No moment where everything collapsed at once. It began the way many inner shifts begin, quietly. Life was moving forward, the days were full, responsibilities were met, prayers were performed. Yet somewhere beneath all of that movement, something felt distant, not lost, not broken, just muted, like a room where the lights are on but the warmth is gone. Have you ever felt that? You still pray, but the prayer feels routine. You still remember God, but the heart doesn't lean forward the way it once did. You recite, yet something inside remains untouched. At first, it's easy to ignore. We tell ourselves it's tiredness, stress, the pace of life, and maybe it is, but over time the heart notices. There is a subtle weight, not painful, just persistent, a sense that the soul is present yet not fully awake. It was during a moment like this that the idea of committing to a single dhikr for 40 days arose, not as a vow, not as a challenge, and certainly not as a promise of transformation. It was simpler than that. It was an act of honesty. 40 days is not an unfamiliar number in spiritual tradition. It appears quietly, again and again, as a measure of ripening rather than force, time enough for habits to soften, long enough for sincerity to prove itself. But in that moment, it wasn't the number that mattered. It was the intention behind it. There was no expectation of visions, no hope for sudden peace. The heart wasn't asking for miracles, it was asking for presence. Have you ever reached a point where you no longer want more knowledge, only more truth? The decision was simple, one dhikr, spoken consistently, without pressure, without drama. If the heart felt nothing, that would be accepted. If distractions came, they would be noticed and allowed to pass. The goal was not to feel something special, but to remain. Ibn Arabi teaches that the heart does not open through force, but through correspondence. When the outer action and the inner intention align long enough, the heart begins to respond, not because it is commanded, but because it feels safe. That understanding shaped the decision. This was not about controlling the heart, it was about giving it time. So the days were approached gently. Sometimes the dhikr was said with focus, other times it felt mechanical, sometimes it was remembered easily, other times it was nearly forgotten, but each day it was returned to. And in that return, something subtle was already happening. The world did not change, circumstances remained the same, but a quiet agreement had been made within, to stop rushing the heart, to stop demanding results, and to allow remembrance to work in its own way. Because perhaps the heart does not resist God. Perhaps it resists being hurried. And so, without announcing it to anyone, without marking it as something special, the journey began, not toward something new, but toward something long familiar, patiently waiting to be noticed again. The first few days did not feel spiritual at all. In fact, they felt heavier than expected. The dhikr was simple, the intention was clear, and yet the moment it was time to sit, something resisted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt, a restlessness in the body, a sudden urgency to check something, a stream of thoughts that seemed to arrive all at once as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Have you ever noticed how distraction appears most strongly when you choose stillness? At first it was confusing. There was no obvious reason for this resistance. Life had not changed, the days were the same, and yet the heart felt less cooperative than before. The mind wandered more. The dhikr felt dry, mechanical, almost foreign on the tongue. This is often where people stop. Not because they don't believe, but because they assume something is wrong. They take resistance as a sign of failure. They interpret heaviness as proof that the practice is not working. But the early days of remembrance are not meant to feel sweet. They are meant to reveal what has been layered over the heart. Ibn Arabi speaks of the heart as a place that responds to what it is accustomed to. When it has been fed noise, speed, and constant outward attention, silence feels unfamiliar. When it has been trained to react, Stillness feels uncomfortable. The resistance is not rejection, it is adjustment. Think of a room that has been closed for a long time. When you open the windows, the air does not feel fresh immediately. The dust rises first. The particles become visible. The light exposes what was already there. The same happens with the heart. As the days continued, small excuses began to appear. I'll do it later. I'll do it when I'm more focused. Today feels off. None of these thoughts were aggressive. They were reasonable, polite even, but they all carried the same message: postpone presence. Have you ever wondered why the heart negotiates most when it is about to be honest? There was a quiet realization forming during these days. The struggle was not with remembrance. The struggle was with consistency, with showing up when nothing seemed to happen, with staying when the heart offered no immediate reward. This is where sincerity is tested, not through intensity but through patience. The dhikr continued anyway, not heroically, not perfectly. Sometimes it was rushed, sometimes it was scattered, but it was not abandoned, and that mattered more than it seemed. Because in the language of the heart, return is more important than performance. Nothing had softened yet, no calm had arrived, but something important was becoming clear. The resistance itself was information. It was revealing how much the heart had grown used to being elsewhere. And perhaps that was the first gift of those early days, not peace, but awareness. The heart was not getting worse. It was becoming visible. Somewhere around the first stretch of days, something unexpected happened. The resistance did not fade. It deepened. Not in the body, but in the inner world. As the dhikr continued, the heart did not become quieter. Instead, it became louder. Thoughts that had been dormant for years began to rise without warning. Old conversations replayed themselves. Regrets surfaced at inconvenient moments. Emotions appeared that did not seem connected to the present at all. Have you ever sat in silence and suddenly remembered something you thought you had long moved past? At first, this felt unsettling. There was an assumption that remembrance would bring immediate calm, that it would smooth the mind and settle the heart. But what emerged instead was clutter, a crowd of inner voices, a restlessness that seemed to grow the more attention was withdrawn from the outer world. This is where many misunderstand what is happening. According to Ibn Arabi, the heart is not a still lake, it is a mirror. And when remembrance turns the heart toward its true direction, the mirror does not immediately shine. It first reveals what has been covering it. For years, the heart had been busy, occupied with responsibilities, worries, ambitions, and unspoken emotions. There was no space for these things to be fully seen, so they remained hidden beneath movement. Dhikr did not create them. It removed the distraction that had kept them quiet. This is why silence can feel overwhelming before it becomes peaceful. The mind tried to make sense of it. Why now? Why this memory? Why this emotion? But the heart does not operate through logic. It releases what it has been holding when it finally feels attended to. Imagine stirring a glass of water that has been left untouched for days. The sediment does not disappear. It rises. The water looks cloudier before it clears. But this cloudiness is not a step backward. It is the beginning of settling. The same was happening inwardly. The dhikr remained unchanged. The words were the same. The rhythm was the same. But the experience was no longer neutral. It was revealing. And that revelation was uncomfortable. There were moments when stopping felt easier than continuing. Moments when the heart felt too busy, too distracted, too heavy to stay present. But beneath that discomfort, a quiet understanding began to form. What if this was not a disturbance, but a cleansing? Ibn Arabi reminds us that the heart does not open by adding something new, but by removing what does not belong. And removal is rarely gentle at first. It requires exposure. It requires patience. It requires trust. Trust that what is surfacing is not meant to overwhelm, but to be released. Slowly the questions changed. Instead of asking, "Why am I feeling this?" the heart began to ask, "What is ready to leave?" And in that shift, something softened. The noise had not disappeared, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt temporary, like a passing storm rather than a permanent condition. The heart was not resisting remembrance. It was responding to it. And perhaps this was the moment when the practice stopped being about words on the tongue and began to touch something deeper, something that had been waiting quietly for permission to rise and be seen. There is no clear moment you can point to and say, "This is when it changed." Nothing dramatic announces itself. No sudden stillness descends. No inner voice explains what is happening. And yet, somewhere between continuing and almost giving up, something begins to loosen. The dhikr is still there, repeated day after day, but it no longer feels like something being done. It feels more like something being returned to. The resistance that once arrived immediately now comes later, softer, as if unsure of its place. Have you ever noticed how persistence reshapes what once felt heavy? The heart begins to cooperate, not because it has been forced, but because it has grown familiar with presence. The words no longer sound foreign. They no longer feel like an interruption to life. They settle in naturally, like a rhythm the heart remembers rather than learns. This is where effort starts to soften. Ibn Arabi speaks of alignment, of the moment when the inner and the outer stop pulling in opposite directions. When intention remains steady long enough, the heart slowly follows, not through obedience but through trust. In these days, the dhikr begins to extend beyond its appointed time. The words echo inwardly during ordinary moments, while walking, while waiting, while sitting in silence. Not loudly, not insistently, just there. It is subtle enough that you might miss it if you are looking for something grand. The changes show up quietly, reactions slow down, irritation loses its sharpness, the urge to fill every moment with noise weakens. There is space between thoughts, even if only briefly, and in that space the heart rests. Have you ever experienced a calm that did not need to be explained? There is also a strange relief in realizing that nothing needs to be achieved. The dhikr is no longer measured by feeling or outcome. It becomes something closer to companionship, a presence that does not demand attention, yet is always available. This is where many misunderstand spiritual practice. They assume depth arrives through intensity, through longer hours, stronger effort, louder emotion. But what unfolds here is different. Depth arrives through consistency without pressure. The heart, having released what it was holding, begins to feel lighter, not joyful in an obvious way, but unburdened, as if something unnecessary has been set down, though it is difficult to say what it was. Ibn Arabi reminds us that the heart opens when it is no longer being interrogated, when it is allowed to move at its own pace, when it is trusted. And in trusting the process, a quiet companionship forms between the heart and remembrance. The dhikr does not solve problems. Life remains complex. Responsibilities remain, but something fundamental has shifted. The heart is no longer bracing itself against silence. It is beginning to recognize it. This is not the end of the journey. It is not even the destination. It is simply the moment when the heart stops resisting and starts listening. And once the heart listens, even briefly, it never forgets how that stillness feels. It is one thing for remembrance to exist in a quiet moment. It is another for it to follow you into life. Somewhere along the way, the dhikr stops belonging only to stillness. It begins to appear in ordinary moments, uninvited but welcome, not as words repeating clearly in the mind, but as a subtle awareness beneath what is happening. Conversations feel different. You listen more than you speak, and when you do speak, the words seem to arrive with less urgency. There is less need to explain yourself fully, less pressure to be understood immediately. Have you ever noticed how calm changes the way you hear others? Situations that once triggered quick reactions now pause you for a moment. The pause is small, barely noticeable, but it is enough. Enough to choose a softer response. Enough to step back rather than lean forward. Enough to let something pass instead of engaging it. Nothing about life has slowed down. The world moves as it always has, but something inside you is no longer rushing to keep up. Ibn Arabi teaches that when the heart remembers God, the world returns to its proper scale. It does not disappear. It does not lose meaning, but it no longer overwhelms. Events take their rightful place, no longer mistaken for absolutes. This begins to show itself in subtle ways. Small frustrations dissolve faster. A delayed response no longer feels like rejection. A missed opportunity no longer feels like loss. Even moments of loneliness feel quieter, less sharp at the edges. Not because they are gone, but because they are being held differently. Have you ever felt a problem remain, yet lose its power over you? Remembrance does not remove difficulty. It changes the heart's posture toward it. Instead of bracing, the heart softens. Instead of tightening, it opens slightly. And in that opening, endurance becomes possible without exhaustion. The most surprising change is not emotional, it is perceptual. You begin to notice how often the heart used to demand immediate answers, immediate relief, immediate certainty. Dhikr does not satisfy these demands, it gently dissolves them. The need for constant resolution weakens. Patience no longer feels like waiting, it feels like standing. Ibn Arabi describes this as returning the heart to its center. When the heart is centered, it no longer swings wildly between hope and fear. It remains anchored, even as circumstances change. Daily life becomes less fragmented. You move through tasks with more presence, not because you are trying to be mindful, but because the heart is less scattered. The noise has not vanished, but it no longer dominates. There are moments when you catch yourself responding differently than you once would have. A softer word, a delayed judgment, a quiet acceptance. And when you notice this, it surprises you, not because it feels forced, but because it feels natural. This is how remembrance works when it is allowed to mature. It does not announce itself. It integrates. It weaves itself into how you see, how you listen, how you endure. And perhaps this is the clearest sign that something real is happening. Not that life has changed, but that you are no longer meeting it with the same heart you once had. There comes a point when the change is no longer measured by behavior, but by awareness. The heart begins to notice itself. Not in a self-conscious way and not with analysis, but with presence. Emotions are felt earlier, before they harden into reactions. Thoughts are noticed as they arise before they pull the heart away. There is a quiet witnessing that settles in, gentle and steady. Have you ever realized you were about to react, and then did? This awareness does not feel like control. In fact, it feels like the absence of control. The heart no longer tries to manage every inner movement. It simply observes, and in that observation, many things lose their grip. Ibn Arabi teaches that true remembrance does not suppress the self. It illuminates it. When the heart is lit from within, what once dominated it becomes visible, and what is visible can no longer rule unconsciously. This is where clarity appears. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of seeing. You begin to recognize patterns you never noticed before. How certain thoughts always lead to tension. How certain emotions arise from old fears rather than present realities. How much of what you carry does not belong to the moment you are in. This realization is not heavy, it is relieving. The heart stops fighting itself. You may notice that inner conversations grow quieter, not silent but softer. The constant commentary weakens. There is less narration, less interpretation, less mental noise. Life is experienced more directly, without being filtered so heavily through judgment. Have you ever felt peace without needing a reason? This stage does not feel spiritual in the way people imagine spirituality. There are no elevated states, no sense of being above life. On the contrary, there is a deeper intimacy with life as it is. You feel more human, not less. Ibn Arabi speaks of balance as the natural state of the heart when it is aligned with remembrance. In balance, nothing is exaggerated. Joy does not intoxicate. Difficulty does not crush. Everything is held with proportion. What changes most is the relationship to struggle. When difficulty arises, the heart no longer immediately asks, "Why is this happening to me?" Instead, it remains present long enough to experience what is actually being asked of it. Sometimes that is patience, sometimes surrender, sometimes simply staying. This is when the heart realizes something essential. It was never broken. It was never distant by nature. It was distracted. Remembrance does not repair the heart, it returns it to itself. And once the heart tastes this return, even briefly, it recognizes the difference. It begins to prefer awareness over reaction, presence over escape, and stillness over noise. This preference is not forced. It arises naturally as the heart remembers what it feels like to be whole. And from here, the journey moves deeper, not toward something extraordinary, but toward a quiet intimacy that begins to feel like home. By the time the 40th day arrived, there was no sense of arrival. No inner announcement. No moment that demanded to be marked. In fact, it would have been easy to miss if you were looking for something dramatic. Life looked the same from the outside. The same responsibilities, the same routines, the same unanswered questions waiting patiently in the background. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The heart felt settled. Not happy in the way happiness is usually measured, not free of temptation or doubt, but grounded, as if it had found its footing again after a long period of standing on uneven ground. Have you ever realized something changed only after you stopped trying to measure it? What was most striking was not the presence of new feelings, but the absence of an old strain. The constant inner tension, the subtle bracing against life, had eased. The heart no longer felt like it was pushing itself forward or pulling itself back. It simply stood where it was. This is what surprised me the most. The Dhikr had not added something extraordinary to my life. It had removed something unnecessary. Ibn Arabi speaks of remembrance as a return, not an acquisition. The heart does not gain closeness to God, it remembers the closeness that was never lost. Distance, he teaches, is a condition of perception, not reality. On the 40th day, that teaching made sense, not intellectually but inwardly. Faith no longer felt like something to maintain. It felt lived, quiet, unforced. There was less concern about whether things were working, less anxiety about spiritual progress. The need to evaluate every inner movement had softened. Temptation still appeared, old habits still knocked, but their voices were weaker. They no longer sounded convincing. What once felt compelling now felt tiring. The taste had changed. Have you ever noticed how something loses power the moment it stops feeling necessary? Prayer felt different too, not longer, not more intense, but more honest. There was less performance in it, less self-monitoring. The heart was present without trying to be impressive even to itself. And perhaps that was the real change. The shock was not that the heart had transformed. The shock was realizing how much effort had once gone into holding it together. Remembrance had not created peace. It had revealed what remained when striving softened, when urgency loosened its grip, when the heart was allowed to be where it already was. By day 40, it was clear that nothing had ended. This was not a conclusion. It was a clarification. The heart had not reached something new. It had returned to something familiar, something quietly waiting beneath years of noise and effort. And once that familiarity was recognized, it became impossible to forget. not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. If this journey sounds familiar, it is not because it is unique. It is because it reflects something many hearts experience, quietly and privately, without ever putting words to it. The sense of distance that cannot be explained. The longing that does not ask for more, only for real. The fatigue of trying to feel close to God through effort alone. Perhaps that is why stories like this resonate. Not because they promise transformation, but because they name what has already been felt. Have you ever stayed with something long enough to discover it was changing you without announcing itself? What happened over those 40 days was not the result of discipline or strength. It was the result of staying, of returning again and again, even when nothing seemed to respond, of allowing time to do what force never can. This is what Ibn Arabi points toward when he speaks of divine timing. The heart is not opened by intensity, but by readiness. And readiness cannot be rushed. It arrives when sincerity is given space to breathe. You may be listening to this and thinking of your own life, your own routines, your own moments of restlessness or quiet longing. Perhaps you have already tried to change yourself many times. Perhaps you have asked why certain practices felt heavy, or why your heart resisted what your mind believed. What if nothing was wrong with you? What if the heart was simply asking to be approached differently? Remembrance, when it is consistent and gentle, does not demand results. It invites relationship. It teaches the heart how to stay instead of escape, how to listen instead of evaluate, how to soften instead of strive. And maybe that is the deeper lesson here. The heart does not open when it is pressured to improve. It opens when it feels safe enough to return. If you were to take anything from this journey, let it be this: change does not always arrive as a breakthrough. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet shift in how you meet your own inner life. A little less urgency, a little more patience, a little more trust in what unfolds slowly. So if you find yourself wondering whether small, consistent acts of remembrance matter, remember this: the heart responds to what is steady, not what is impressive. And perhaps the real question is not whether you are ready to commit to something for 40 days. Perhaps the question is simpler. Are you willing to stay long enough to listen to what your heart has been trying to tell you all along? Before you go, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever noticed how the smallest, quietest practices in your life end up changing you more deeply than the ones you try to force? If this journey resonated with you, take a second to support the channel. Like this video, subscribe to Voice of Sufism, and turn on the bell so you don't miss future reflections that explore the hidden meanings woven into everyday life. I'd also love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a subtle change in your heart through consistency rather than intensity? Share your reflections in the comments. Your experience may help someone else feel less alone on their path. And if you'd like to continue this journey, you'll find related videos appearing on your screen now. Each one is an invitation to slow down, reflect, and listen a little more closely. Until next time, stay with what is gentle,